Eleanor always shows up empty-handed, my daughter-in-law said loudly enough for the entire reunion table to hear, right before everyone started laughing. My son didn't defend me. He just looked down at his plate and took another sip of wine like he hadn't heard a thing. I smiled anyway. I've learned that people become very honest when they think you have nothing left to offer them. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Because I never imagined my story would travel farther than that lake house in northern Michigan where my family decided I was an embarrassment. The Whitmore family reunion happened every summer during the first weekend of July. For nearly 40 years, someone in the family rented a large property near the water, and everyone came pretending we were closer than we really were. My late husband Charles used to love those weekends. He believed family mattered more than pride, more than old grudges, more than money. Sometimes I wonder what he would think if he could see them now. I arrived almost an hour late that afternoon because my old Buick overheated twice on the highway. The air conditioning barely worked anymore, and by the time I pulled into the gravel driveway beside the enormous rental property, my blouse clung uncomfortably to my back from the heat. Every other car parked outside looked polished and expensive. Black SUVs, luxury sedans, a bright white Tesla that belonged to my niece Rebecca. I parked beside a patch of overgrown bushes near the edge of the property where nobody would notice my car immediately. But of course Vanessa noticed anyway. She notices everything that can be used against someone later. The reunion house itself looked like something from a magazine. 3 stories tall with stone columns, wide windows facing the lake, and a massive wooden deck crowded with relatives holding cocktails and paper plates loaded with barbecue. I stood there for a moment holding the blueberry pie I had baked early that morning, trying to smooth the wrinkles from my skirt before walking toward the patio. Nobody came to greet me. Nobody waved. I could already hear laughter drifting across the yard before I even stepped onto the deck. Rebecca spotted me first. "Well," she announced loudly, lowering her sunglasses, "look who finally made it." Several heads turned. Some smiled politely. Others didn't bother pretending. Vanessa stood beside the outdoor kitchen wearing a pale designer sundress and gold jewelry that sparkled every time she moved her hand. She looked me up and down slowly before her eyes landed on the pie dish in my hands. "Eleanor always shows up empty-handed," she said with a laugh, nudging Daniel lightly with her elbow. "Unless you count grocery store pie." A few people chuckled immediately. Someone near the grill snorted into his drink. Rebecca laughed hardest of all. "Careful," she added. "That pie probably cost her entire monthly budget." More laughter followed. Sharp, casual, comfortable. The kind of laughter people use when they've mocked someone for years. I looked at Daniel then. My son. My only child. He stood beside Vanessa in an expensive navy polo shirt I had never seen before, holding a wine glass in one hand while staring down at his phone. He didn't tell her to stop. Didn't tell anyone to stop. He simply slid the phone into his pocket and avoided my eyes completely. That hurt more than the joke itself. I handed the pie quietly to a teenage cousin near the table, and thanked her for taking it inside. My hand stayed perfectly steady. Years ago, I would have cried in private after something like that. Years ago, I would have spent the entire night wondering what I had done wrong as a mother, as a widow, as a person. But grief changes you. So does loneliness. After Charles passed away 5 years earlier, something inside me became quieter. Stronger, maybe. I stopped trying to convince people to value me. I stopped correcting assumptions. And most importantly, I stopped explaining why I lived the way I did. Vanessa smiled sweetly as I finally sat down near the far end of the table closest to the kitchen door. Not beside family. Not near the lake view. Near the stack of paper towels and condiment trays. "We saved you a seat," she said brightly. Rebecca nearly choked trying not to laugh. I folded my hands in my lap and smiled back politely. Then I looked around the table at all the faces pretending not to stare at my thrift store handbag resting beside my chair. They thought they knew exactly who I was. Poor widow. Old-fashioned. Unsuccessful. A disappointment. What they didn't know was that before the weekend ended, every single person at that table would look at me differently. The afternoon sun settled heavily across the lake while the reunion carried on around me like I was invisible. Children ran through the yard with dripping popsicles. Music played softly through outdoor speakers mounted near the deck railing. Someone opened another bottle of wine near the grill, while my cousins compared vacation photos from Italy and Aspen. I sat quietly at the far end of the long patio table beside a half-empty bowl of potato salad, and listened to people talk about money as if it were a competition nobody could escape. Rebecca loved being the loudest person in every room. She had inherited that from her mother, my Aunt Lorraine, who believed silence meant weakness. Rebecca leaned back in her chair dramatically, showing off a diamond bracelet that flashed every time she lifted her glass. "The market has been unbelievable this year," she announced. "I told Jason we should buy another rental property before prices climb again." Vanessa nodded immediately. "Exactly. Real estate is everything now. People who rent their whole lives are basically throwing money away." Her eyes flicked toward me for less than a second before she smiled into her drink, small enough that anyone else might have missed it. I did not. Daniel sat beside her scrolling through stock charts on his phone while pretending to listen. He used to talk to me constantly when he was younger. At family gatherings, he would pull his chair beside mine and whisper jokes during dinner until Charles told him to behave. Now he barely looked at me long enough to say hello. Sometimes distance happens slowly enough that you do not notice it until years later when suddenly your child feels like a polite stranger. I reached for my iced tea and realized the glass had gone warm. Nobody had asked whether I needed anything since I arrived. Not water. Not a plate. Not even whether my drive had been safe. It was strange how quickly people stop seeing you once they decide you no longer matter. Across the patio, Vanessa laughed loudly at something Rebecca said while Chloe stood nearby looking uncomfortable. My granddaughter had inherited Daniel's eyes but not his silence. More than once during the afternoon, I caught her glancing toward me with an expression that reminded me painfully of the little girl who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms. "Grandma, do you want me to get you fresh ice?" she asked quietly while passing my chair. Before I could answer, Vanessa interrupted from across the table. "Chloe, sweetheart, your grandmother is fine. She survived the Great Depression." A few people laughed again. Not hard this time. More awkwardly. But Vanessa still smiled proudly at herself afterward. I folded my napkin carefully onto my lap and stared out toward the lake instead of responding. The water shimmered beneath the late afternoon light, smooth and endless except for the occasional wake from passing boats. Charles used to love lakes like this. Quiet places where nobody cared what watch you wore, or how expensive your shoes looked. He always said wealthy people who needed to prove they were wealthy were usually hiding something. At the time I thought he was being cynical. Now I knew better. Rebecca suddenly leaned forward and pointed toward my handbag resting beside my chair. "I still cannot believe you carry the same purse every year," she said. "That thing has to be older than Chloe." Vanessa laughed into her wine glass. "Eleanor probably still balances a checkbook by hand." "Actually," Rebecca added smugly, "my financial advisor says people who never invest end up relying on family later. That scares me more than anything." Daniel finally looked up then, though not at me. "Retirement is rough now," he said casually. "You really have to plan ahead." Something about hearing my own son speak about aging like it was someone else's burden tightened quietly inside my chest. Daniel knew perfectly well that after Charles died, I never asked him for anything. Not once. I paid my own bills, maintained my own home, fixed my own leaking roof last winter after waiting 3 weeks for a contractor who never showed up. Yet somehow, in Vanessa's version of the family story, I had become the cautionary tale. The sad old widow everyone tolerated out of obligation. Chloe sat down beside me a few minutes later carrying a fresh glass of iced tea without saying a word. I thanked her softly and touched her hand for a moment. Vanessa noticed immediately. Her smile tightened almost invisibly. "You spoil her," she said to me. "That is why Chloe never understands how hard the real world is." I looked at my granddaughter then. Sweet, quiet Chloe who worked 2 jobs while finishing college because her parents believed struggle built character. I wondered what Vanessa would say if she knew who had been secretly paying part of Chloe's tuition for the last 2 years. But I kept that thought to myself. Some truths are more powerful when they arrive late. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the air around the reunion house changed in that subtle way family gatherings often do after enough food and alcohol. Conversations became louder. Smiles became less careful. Old frustrations slipped out disguised as jokes. I had seen it happen for decades. Families rarely say what they truly think at the beginning of the day. They wait until they feel comfortable, until they forget someone might remember their words later. Dinner was served just after 6 o'clock. Long trays of grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, baked macaroni, and fresh rolls covered the outdoor buffet table, while everyone crowded around filling paper plates, as if they had not eaten in weeks. Nobody invited me into the line. I waited until nearly everyone had finished before quietly helping myself to the leftovers near the end of the table. By then, the macaroni tray was almost empty and only 2 dinner rolls remained. I did not mind. Hunger becomes less important with age. Pride does not. I carried my plate carefully back toward my seat when I overheard Vanessa speaking to 2 cousins near the drink station. "I just do not understand people who settle for surviving," she said while adjusting one of her bracelets. "Life is supposed to move forward. You either build something meaningful or you stay stuck forever." One cousin nodded politely. The other looked uncomfortable. Vanessa lowered her voice slightly but not enough. "Honestly, if Daniel and I had not worked so hard these past few years, we would probably end up exactly like Eleanor. Old, lonely, and counting coupons." Rebecca burst into laughter beside her. "You are terrible," she said, though she sounded delighted. My footsteps slowed for half a second before I kept walking. They did not notice me pass behind them carrying my plate. Or maybe they did not care. I sat down again near the edge of the patio while the rest of the family gathered closer together beneath the string lights overlooking the lake. The sky had turned soft shades of orange and pink by then, and boats drifted quietly across the water in the distance. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, the entire evening carried that familiar ache of being tolerated rather than welcomed. Chloe sat beside me again halfway through dinner. "Grandma, your pie was the best dessert," she whispered quietly. "I had 2 slices." I smiled at her. "That is because you inherited excellent taste." She laughed softly, but her eyes kept drifting toward her parents. Nervous. Careful. I recognized that look. Children learn very young how to survive difficult personalities. Across the table, Daniel was explaining cryptocurrency investments to several cousins, while Vanessa interrupted constantly to mention the new country club membership they had recently purchased. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Every laugh slightly too loud. It reminded me of people standing inside expensive stores they cannot truly afford, pretending they belong there long enough that eventually they believe it themselves. Rebecca suddenly tapped her wine glass with a fork for attention. "All right," she announced dramatically. "I think it is time for the annual Whitmore family update." Groans and laughter followed immediately. Apparently this had become a reunion tradition during the years I stopped attending regularly after Charles passed away. "Everyone shares one accomplishment from the year," Rebecca explained smugly. "Promotions, vacations, investments, renovations. Whatever exciting thing happened." Vanessa clapped immediately. "I love this game." Of course she did. The updates began moving around the table one by one. New kitchens. Promotions. Luxury cruises. Golf memberships. Second homes. Every story sounded strangely similar, as if everyone had spent the year competing in the exact same contest. When it reached Daniel, he smiled proudly and wrapped one arm around Vanessa's shoulders. "Honestly, this year has been huge for us financially," he said. "We are finally surrounded by people who think bigger. That changes everything." Vanessa nodded eagerly. "Mindset matters. Successful people build successful lives." Rebecca turned toward me then with a smile so artificial it barely looked human. "Your turn, Eleanor." The entire table became quiet. I set down my fork carefully and folded my hands together. "Nothing very exciting," I said calmly. "I planted tomatoes this spring. They are doing well." For one second nobody spoke. Then Rebecca laughed loudly enough to echo across the patio. Vanessa nearly spit out her wine trying not to laugh with her. "Tomatoes," Rebecca repeated. "That is adorable." Daniel shook his head slowly with the kind of embarrassed smile people use when apologizing for a relative without actually saying the words aloud. "Mom never cared much about ambition," he said casually. "She likes simple things." The sentence settled over me heavier than all the others combined. Not because it was cruel, because it was dismissive. As if the entire life I built with Charles could be summarized as small and forgettable simply because I never felt the need to perform success for strangers. I looked around the table quietly then, at the expensive watches, the designer handbags, the polished smiles, the endless need to prove worth through money. And for the first time that evening, I almost felt sorry for them. The laughter around the table slowly faded after Rebecca's little game ended. But the feeling it left behind stayed with me long after everyone returned to their conversations. I sat quietly beneath the string lights listening to silverware scrape against paper plates while warm evening wind drifted in from the lake. Somewhere down by the dock, children were setting off small sparklers that reflected softly across the dark water. It should have been beautiful. Instead, I felt like I was watching strangers perform a version of family none of them actually believed in. Vanessa eventually disappeared inside the house with several of my younger cousins to refill drinks while Rebecca moved toward the fire pit area carrying another bottle of wine. Daniel stayed at the table scrolling through emails on his phone with the same tense expression he always wore now. Busy. Distracted. Important. That was how he liked people to see him. It amazed me sometimes how much effort people spend building appearances while neglecting the things that actually matter. Chloe remained beside me after everyone else drifted away. She tucked one leg beneath herself in the chair and stared out toward the lake for several seconds before speaking. "Grandma," she said softly, "I am sorry about tonight." I looked at her carefully. "You have nothing to apologize for." "Yes, I do." Her voice dropped lower. "Nobody should talk to you like that." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The music from the patio speakers shifted to an old jazz song Charles used to love playing on Sunday mornings while reading the newspaper in our kitchen. The memory hit me so suddenly that I could almost smell his coffee again. Strong. Black. Always too hot. Grief is strange that way. It waits quietly for ordinary moments before reminding you that someone is gone forever. "Your grandfather used to hate these reunions," I said quietly after a while. Chloe looked surprised. "Really?" I nodded slowly. "He loved family. But he hated pretending." A small smile touched her face. "That sounds like Grandpa." It did. Charles Whitmore spent most of his life being underestimated by people who confuse simplicity with weakness. When we first married, we lived in a tiny two-bedroom home outside Grand Rapids with peeling linoleum floors and windows that rattled every winter. He worked 12-hour shifts at an automotive plant while taking accounting classes at night because he believed stability mattered more than comfort. I still remember him sitting at our kitchen table surrounded by financial books from the public library, while Daniel slept upstairs in his crib. Most people saw an exhausted factory worker. They never noticed how carefully he watched everything, how quietly he learned. Years later, when Charles started investing money little by little, people treated it like a hobby. Even family laughed sometimes. Rebecca's father once told him investing was just gambling for middle-class people pretending to be rich. Charles only smiled and kept turning pages in his notebook. By the time he retired, he owned shares in companies most people at these reunions could not even afford to pronounce. But he never changed after the money came. That was the part people never understood. We stayed in the same house, drove practical cars, bought clothes because they lasted, not because strangers would admire them. "Never teach people to measure your value by your spending," he told me once while we repaired our old porch swing together. "The moment you do that, they stop seeing you. They only see your wallet." I did not fully understand those words until after he died. The first year without Charles felt like standing outside during a blizzard without a coat. Everything became colder, quieter. Even Daniel changed almost immediately after the funeral. Vanessa began making little comments disguised as concern, suggestions about downsizing, questions about retirement accounts, casual reminders that maintaining a home alone at my age must be exhausting. First, I believed she meant well. Loneliness makes you generous with excuses. Chloe touched my hand gently, pulling me back to the present. "Mom thinks money proves everything," she admitted quietly. "Dad too sometimes." I looked toward the house where laughter spilled through the open windows. "Money reveals people," I said softly. "It does not improve them." She stared at me for a long moment then smiled faintly. "You always say things that sound simple at first, but then I keep thinking about them afterward." I laughed quietly under my breath. "That came from your grandfather too." Inside the house, Vanessa's voice suddenly carried across the patio again, followed by another burst of laughter. I did not hear every word clearly. Only enough. Some people just get comfortable being mediocre. Chloe looked embarrassed immediately. But strangely, I no longer felt hurt. Just tired. Tired of watching people perform success like actors, terrified the audience might leave if they stopped smiling for too long. And somewhere deep inside, I could already feel the evening shifting towards something none of them expected. By 8 o'clock, the reunion had split into smaller groups scattered across the property. Some relatives gathered near the fire pit wrapped in light blankets, while others drifted inside toward the game room and kitchen. The air smelled faintly of charcoal, lake water, and citronella candles burning along the patio railings. I remained outside alone for several minutes after Chloe went inside to help clean dishes. The quiet felt good. Necessary even. There is a point during certain evenings when you stop hoping people will surprise you and simply begin observing them clearly. I had reached that point hours ago. From where I sat, I could see reflections moving through the large windows inside the house. Vanessa stood near the kitchen island pouring wine while Rebecca leaned against the counter laughing loudly at something Daniel had said. Every movement looked polished and effortless from a distance, like a commercial for a perfect American family. But perfection becomes much less convincing once you know where the cracks are hidden. I was about to stand up and head inside when I heard hurried footsteps crossing the patio behind me. Chloe appeared carrying her phone with an anxious expression on her face. "Grandma," she said quietly, lowering her voice immediately, "there is a problem." I straightened slightly in my chair. "What happened?" "The rental manager is here." She glanced nervously toward the house. "Apparently there is some issue with the reservation payment." For a second, neither of us moved. Then raised voices drifted faintly through the open kitchen windows. Rebecca's voice first. Sharp. Defensive. Then, Vanessa's higher, more strained than before. I followed Chloe inside slowly. The kitchen no longer sounded relaxed. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Several relatives stood awkwardly near the dining area, pretending not to stare, while a man in a navy polo shirt held a tablet beside the kitchen counter, speaking calmly to Rebecca. "I understand there must be some confusion," he said professionally, "but the remaining balance of $12,400 was due this afternoon." Rebecca crossed her arms immediately. "That cannot be right. I already paid the deposit months ago." "Yes, ma'am," the manager replied politely. "The deposit covered only the initial reservation hold. The final payment authorization was declined earlier today." Silence spread across the room almost instantly. Rebecca's face darkened. "Declined?" She laughed sharply. "That is impossible." Beside her, Vanessa pulled out her phone so quickly she nearly dropped it. Daniel stepped closer, looking irritated already. Not embarrassed. Irritated. Like the situation itself had inconvenienced him personally. "Just run the card again," he said flatly. The manager nodded patiently. "We already attempted that twice, sir." Rebecca snatched her designer handbag from the counter and pulled out another card with visibly shaking fingers. "Use this one." Everyone watched quietly while the manager entered the information into the tablet. A long pause followed. Then another polite smile. "I am sorry, ma'am." Rebecca's expression froze completely. Vanessa looked horrified. "What do you mean declined?" she asked too quickly. The manager remained calm. The authorization did not process successfully. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from the dishwasher humming softly behind us. Rebecca's confidence had disappeared so suddenly it almost felt unreal. Just an hour earlier she had been lecturing the family about investments and financial success. Now she could barely keep her hands steady. Daniel rubbed his forehead impatiently. "Fine," he muttered. "I will handle it." Vanessa immediately turned toward him. "Daniel, our card is already close to the limit after Cabo." He looked at her sharply. "Not now." The room became even quieter after that. I noticed several relatives exchange uncomfortable looks. Nobody seemed eager to volunteer help. Wealth impresses people only when it looks effortless. The moment strain appears, admiration usually disappears with it. Chloe stood beside me near the hallway, pretending to scroll through her phone, while secretly watching her parents unravel in real time. I felt strangely calm. Not smug. Not satisfied. Just calm. Because for the first time all evening, nobody was looking at my handbag or old shoes anymore. The manager cleared his throat gently. Unfortunately, if the balance is not resolved tonight, company policy requires us to suspend the reservation agreement by tomorrow morning. Vanessa went pale immediately. Tomorrow morning? Rebecca stared at the tablet like it had personally betrayed her. Daniel began typing aggressively into his banking app before suddenly stopping. His jaw tightened. Transfer limits, he muttered under his breath. I watched them all quietly from the edge of the kitchen while nobody noticed me standing there. It struck me then how quickly confidence collapses when people build it entirely on appearances. Vanessa finally looked around the room with desperate frustration, searching for solutions. Her eyes passed over cousin after cousin before eventually landing on me for half a second, then moving away again almost immediately, as if asking me for help would somehow make the humiliation worse. I lowered my gaze calmly and folded my hands together. Charles used to say character reveals itself fastest when money becomes uncomfortable. Standing there in that beautiful lakeside kitchen watching expensive people panic over unpaid bills, I realized he had been right about almost everything. The tension inside the kitchen spread through the house faster than smoke. Conversations outside on the patio slowly faded as more relatives wandered in pretending to refill drinks or grab dessert, while quietly trying to understand what was happening. Nobody likes missing a financial disaster, especially wealthy people. Rebecca stood near the counter gripping her wine glass so tightly I thought it might crack in her hand. Vanessa kept whispering furiously to Daniel while checking her phone every few seconds as if staring at numbers long enough might somehow change them. The rental manager remained calm through all of it. Professional. Patient. Probably used to watching expensive people panic in beautiful houses. There has to be some mistake, Rebecca insisted again, though her voice sounded thinner now. I transferred money from my business account last week. The manager nodded politely. I understand, ma'am. Unfortunately, I can only go by the authorization status on file. Daniel exhaled sharply and stepped away from Vanessa toward the dining room windows where cell service seemed stronger. I watched him tap aggressively across his banking app before muttering another curse beneath his breath. He looked exhausted suddenly, older than 42. For the first time all evening, he no longer looked like the confident man Vanessa kept presenting to the family. He looked cornered. What is happening? One of my cousins finally asked carefully from near the refrigerator. Vanessa answered too quickly. Nothing serious. Just a temporary transfer issue. Rebecca forced a laugh immediately afterward. Exactly. Technology problems. But nobody looked convinced anymore. Wealth has a smell when it starts collapsing. Even before the truth arrives, people sense it. I remained near the hallway quietly holding my untouched glass of iced tea, while everyone else spiraled around me. Chloe stood beside me silently. At one point she leaned close enough that only I could hear her. Dad looks scared, she whispered softly. I looked toward Daniel again. She was right. Not angry. Not irritated. Scared. It had probably been years since he felt that emotion in front of other people. Vanessa suddenly turned toward him with panic slipping through her polished voice for the first time all day. Daniel, just use the investment account. His expression darkened immediately. That account is tied up. What do you mean tied up? She snapped quietly. I mean exactly what I said. Rebecca stared between them in disbelief. Wait. You told us business was booming. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. It is complicated. The room became painfully silent after that. Complicated. It was amazing how quickly one word could destroy an entire image people spent years building. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. You said the bonus payments were coming this month. They were delayed. Delayed. Her voice rose despite herself. Daniel, we already spent money expecting those deposits. Several relatives exchanged glances immediately. Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended them. Families become audiences the moment weakness appears. The manager cleared his throat carefully again. I apologize for interrupting, but I do need confirmation about tonight's payment. Daniel looked trapped. Vanessa looked furious. Rebecca looked embarrassed. And suddenly all those conversations earlier about ambition, success, and superior lifestyles felt strangely hollow hanging in the air above everyone's heads. I lowered my gaze toward the old leather handbag resting beside my chair. The same handbag Rebecca mocked barely 2 hours earlier. Inside sat a slim black checkbook I had carried for years beside account information connected to 3 different investment firms Charles established before his death. Quiet accounts. Old accounts. The kind that grow steadily while louder people chase appearances. My fingers rested lightly against the leather handle for a moment before I stood up slowly. Nobody noticed at first. The manager was still speaking quietly with Daniel, while Vanessa whispered angry calculations beneath her breath. I walked calmly across the kitchen floor toward the counter. Even Chloe looked surprised beside me. "Excuse me," I said softly. The room became still almost immediately. Not because my voice was loud, because nobody expected me to speak. The manager turned politely toward me. "Yes, ma'am." I smiled faintly. "How much is still owed?" Rebecca blinked at me in disbelief. Vanessa looked irritated instantly, as though my involvement itself embarrassed her. "Eleanor," she said tightly, "this really is not your concern." I ignored her gently and looked back toward the manager. $12,400? He nodded carefully. "Yes, ma'am." I opened my handbag slowly, then removed my glasses and the small black checkbook resting inside. The room stayed completely silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator behind us. I could feel every pair of eyes watching me now. Curious. Confused. Rebecca actually looked amused for half a second, as if she expected me to offer a few $100s from savings hidden beneath a mattress somewhere. I wrote calmly for several seconds before tearing out the check and handing it to the manager. His eyes lowered toward the amount first, then toward the account information printed beneath my name. I watched the exact moment his expression changed. The manager stared at the check for several long seconds before looking back up at me with an entirely different expression than the one he had worn all evening. Professional politeness shifted quietly into recognition. Respect. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I apologize. I did not realize this account belonged to you." Rebecca frowned immediately. "What does that mean?" The manager hesitated briefly before answering. "This account is attached to one of our premium financial partner institutions." Silence spread through the kitchen again. Heavier this time. Vanessa blinked rapidly as if she had misheard him. Daniel stepped closer toward the counter and looked down at the check still resting in the manager's hand. I watched confusion move slowly across my son's face. Then disbelief. The manager cleared his throat softly. "This payment will process immediately, ma'am." I smiled politely. Good. I would hate for the family reunion to end early. Nobody laughed. A few relatives looked down at the floor instead. Others stared openly at me now with the same attention they had denied me all day. It was astonishing how quickly people learn manners once money enters the room wearing the right suit. Rebecca recovered first. She let out a strange nervous laugh and crossed her arms tightly. "Well," she said too brightly, "looks like Eleanor has been hiding secrets from all of us." Hiding. The word lingered strangely in the air, as though living quietly was somehow dishonest. I slid my checkbook calmly back into my handbag. "Not secrets," I replied softly. "Just privacy." Vanessa stared at me so intensely I could almost hear her thoughts racing behind her smile. Every joke she made earlier now hung awkwardly inside the room like smoke nobody could clear away. "You never mentioned investments," she said carefully after a moment. "You never asked," I answered. Daniel still looked stunned. "Mom," he said slowly, "that account. How much?" His voice faded before finishing the question. I saved him the embarrassment of asking directly. "Enough." The kitchen became quiet again. Even the dishwasher cycle had ended by then, leaving the entire room wrapped in uncomfortable stillness. Rebecca suddenly laughed again, though this time it sounded forced. "Well, now I feel terrible for teasing you about coupons." "Do you?" I asked gently. She stopped smiling immediately. Chloe lowered her eyes beside me, trying unsuccessfully to hide the small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Vanessa stepped forward quickly then, her tone transforming so completely it almost impressed me. "Eleanor, honestly, we were only joking earlier. You know how family is." I looked at her for a long moment. The same woman who called me mediocre less than an hour ago now sounded almost eager for my approval. Yes, I said quietly. I learned quite a bit about family today. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly before finally meeting my eyes directly for the first time all evening. Why did you never tell me? There it was. Not concern about my feelings. Not regret for how they treated me. Curiosity about the money. Charles would have noticed that immediately. Your father and I never believed wealth should become a personality, I said calmly. We taught you that once. Daniel looked away first. Across the kitchen, several relatives suddenly became very interested in helping clean dishes. People often disappear emotionally the moment shame enters a room. Rebecca poured herself another glass of wine with visibly unsteady hands before attempting one last smile. Well, she said, I guess we all underestimated you. I picked up my handbag slowly from the counter. The old leather looked worn beneath. The kitchen lights softened from years of use. Rebecca used to mock Charles for carrying the same wallet 15 years in a row too. He always answered the same way. If something still works, why replace it just to impress people who do not care about you anyway? No, I said softly while sliding the strap over my shoulder. You underestimated simplicity. Nobody spoke after that. Outside, fireworks from another lake house flickered faintly across the water in red and gold reflections. The sounds drifted through the open windows while everyone stood frozen inside that expensive kitchen pretending not to feel uncomfortable. Chloe moved quietly beside me and touched my arm gently. Grandma, she whispered. Can I walk outside with you? I smiled at her warmly. Of course, sweetheart. As we walked toward the patio doors, I could feel every pair of eyes following me now. Earlier that evening, they barely noticed whether I had enough food on my plate. Now they watched me like people studying an entirely different person. But I had not changed at all. That was the saddest part. The only thing that changed was the number they imagined sitting inside my bank account. The night air outside felt cooler after the tension inside the kitchen. Chloe walked beside me quietly as we moved toward the wooden dock extending across the dark lake water. In the distance, soft music drifted from neighboring vacation homes, while small fireworks continued flickering above the shoreline like fading stars. I rested my hands against the dock railing and breathed slowly for the first time all evening. Behind us, through the bright windows of the house, I could still see relatives gathered in nervous little clusters talking about me now instead of ignoring me. Funny how quickly silence turns into fascination once money enters the conversation. Chloe leaned beside me against the railing. I have never seen Mom speechless before, she admitted softly. I laughed quietly under my breath. It does not happen often. She looked down toward the water for several seconds before speaking again. Were you really helping me with college? There it was. The question I knew would come eventually. Turned toward her gently. Who told you? Dad. Her voice sounded smaller now. I overheard him asking Mom if she knew. I smiled faintly. Then I suppose the secret is not much of a secret anymore. Chloe stared at me with wide eyes. Why would you do that without telling me? I looked back toward the lake again before answering. Because pride becomes very expensive when you are young. Her expression softened immediately. Grandma, your grandfather paid for part of my nursing classes before we were married, I continued quietly. I tried refusing at first. He told me accepting help from people who love you is not weakness. Someday you pass it forward. Chloe wiped quickly beneath one eye before smiling embarrassedly. I thought I got scholarships because I worked harder. You did work hard. I touched her hand gently. I only made sure exhaustion did not steal opportunities from you. She looked away then, blinking rapidly while pretending to watch lights reflecting on the lake. I knew that feeling too well. Sometimes kindness hurts more than cruelty because it reminds you how little of it exists elsewhere. Behind us, the patio door opened quietly. Footsteps approached across the deck. Slow. Hesitant. I already knew who it was before turning around. Daniel stopped several feet away from us with both hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. He looked uncomfortable standing there beneath the patio lights. Not polished anymore. Just tired. Human. Can we talk? He asked softly. Chloe glanced between us uncertainly before murmuring something about checking on dessert inside the house. Once she disappeared back toward the patio, silence settled between my son and me. It had been years since we stood alone together without Vanessa nearby filling every empty space with conversation. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck slowly before speaking again. Mom, why did you never tell me about any of this? Same question. Different tone now. Less curiosity. More confusion. Would it have changed how you treated me? I asked quietly. He looked down immediately. The answer sat there between us without needing words. Wind moved softly across the water while somewhere in the distance a boat engine hummed faintly through the dark. Daniel leaned against the railing beside me after a while, though he still could not fully meet my eyes. Things got complicated after Dad died, he admitted. Business pressure. Debt. Trying to keep up. With who? I asked gently. He gave a hollow little laugh beneath his breath. Everyone. That answer sounded painfully honest. I studied my son carefully beneath the dock lights. The expensive watch. The polished shoes. The tension carved permanently into his face. He looked successful from far away. But up close he looked exhausted. Your father spent his entire life avoiding that trap, I said quietly. What trap? Trying to impress people who would disappear the moment you struggled. Daniel swallowed hard but said nothing. I remembered him at 10 years old helping Charles repaint our old garage because we could not afford contractors back then. He used to be proud of simple things. Honest things. Somewhere along the way, Vanessa had convinced him simplicity looked like failure. We were not mocking you because we hated you, he said finally, though even he sounded uncertain hearing the words aloud. I smiled sadly at that. No. You mocked me because it made you feel safer about yourselves. He looked at me sharply then, maybe realizing for the first time that I had understood everything all along. Mom. Do you know what hurt most tonight? I interrupted softly. It was not Vanessa. Or Rebecca. It was hearing my own son describe me like I wasted my life because I never performed wealth for strangers. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Shame settled visibly across his face now. Real shame. Not embarrassment. There is a difference. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then quietly, almost like a child again, he asked, Did Dad know you kept helping people financially after he passed? I smiled faintly toward the dark water. Your father was the one who taught me how. Daniel stayed beside me on the dock for a long time after that. Neither of us seemed to know exactly what to say anymore. Some silences feel angry. Others feel tired. This one felt honest for the first time in years. Across the lake, the final fireworks faded slowly into darkness while the reunion house behind us grew quieter. People had stopped laughing loudly now. The energy inside had shifted from performance to discomfort, and everyone could feel it. Eventually Daniel exhaled heavily and leaned both hands against the railing. I think somewhere along the way, he admitted quietly, I started believing success meant looking successful all the time. I nodded slowly. That is an expensive belief. He laughed once beneath his breath, though there was no humor in it. You and Dad never cared what people thought. That is not true, I corrected gently. We cared very much. We just learned early that most people stop thinking about you 5 minutes after you leave the room. He stared out at the dark water for several seconds before speaking again. Vanessa grew up differently. I know. Everything in her family was about appearances. Bigger homes. Better schools. Expensive vacations. I thought if I could give her all of that, it meant I was doing well. I looked at my son carefully then. For the first time in years he sounded less like a businessman and more like the young man who once sat beside Charles at our kitchen table, asking questions about mortgages and savings accounts because he wanted to build a stable future someday. Not a flashy one. Stable. Somewhere between ambition and insecurity, he had lost that version of himself. Your father used to say there are 2 kinds of wealthy people, I said quietly. The ones who use money to feel safe, and the ones who use it to feel important. Daniel gave a small nod without looking at me. And the second kind never stops being afraid. We stood there together while soft waves tapped gently against the dock beneath us. Inside the house, I could see silhouettes moving through the windows as relatives slowly cleaned up dinner and avoided conversations they no longer knew how to have. Rebecca had disappeared entirely. Vanessa remained inside speaking quietly to one of my cousins with a tight smile that looked permanently strained now. The performance had cracked. Once that happens, it is difficult to rebuild the illusion. Chloe eventually stepped back outside carrying 2 folded blankets over her arm. "It is getting cold," she said softly. I smiled at her warmly as she draped one blanket around my shoulders before wrapping the other around herself. Such a small gesture. But kindness often lives inside small gestures. That was something Vanessa never understood. Daniel looked at his daughter for a moment before quietly saying, "Your grandmother helped pay for school because she believed in you." Chloe lowered her eyes immediately. "I know. You should have told us," he said to me. I shook my head gently. "And risk making her feel indebted? But she is family." I smiled sadly at that word. Family. The same word people use while wounding each other in ways strangers never would. "Real help does not arrive carrying a spotlight," I said softly. "Your father understood that." Daniel fell silent again. Then after a while, almost reluctantly, he asked, "Are you angry with us?" I thought carefully before answering. The easy response would have been yes. But anger was not the heaviest thing I felt anymore. "No," I said quietly. "I think I am disappointed." The words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Daniel closed his eyes briefly while Chloe looked down toward the dockboards beside her feet. "Not because you struggled financially," I continued gently. "Not because things became difficult. But because somewhere along the way, you started measuring human worth the same way insecure people measure luxury brands." Nobody spoke after that. The lake stretched dark and endless in front of us while cool wind moved softly through the trees along the shoreline. I pulled the blanket closer around my shoulders and suddenly felt very tired. Not old. Just finished. Finished trying to earn softness from people who only respected status. Finished shrinking myself to make others comfortable. Finished pretending I did not notice every insult disguised as humor. After several quiet minutes, I stood slowly from the railing and picked up my handbag. Daniel looked at me immediately. "You are leaving?" I nodded. "I think I have seen enough for one reunion." Chloe stood quickly. "I will walk you to your car." Daniel looked like he wanted to say something else. Maybe apologize again. Maybe explain more. But explanations become meaningless after truth finally arrives. I touched his arm gently before turning away. "Your father loved you very much," I said softly. "Do not spend the rest of your life trying to impress people who would have overlooked the man he really was." Then I walked back toward the house beside Chloe, while the lake behind us settled quietly into darkness. Earlier that day, they saw me as an embarrassment because I drove an old car, carried an old handbag, and lived a quiet life. By the end of the night, nothing about me had changed except their ability to see me clearly.